I'm Ari Redbord, and this is TRM Talks. I am Global Head of Policy at TRM Labs. At TRM, we provide blockchain intelligence software to support law enforcement investigations and to help financial institutions and cryptocurrency businesses mitigate financial crime risk within the emerging digital asset economy. Prior to joining TRM, I spent 15 years in the U.S. federal government, first as a prosecutor at the Department of Justice, and then as a Treasury Department official, where I worked to safeguard the financial system against terrorist financiers, weapons of mass destruction proliferators, drug kingpins, and other rogue actors. On TRM Talks, I sit down with business leaders, policymakers, investigators, and friends from across the crypto ecosystem who are working to build a safer financial system. Today, we're talking to Kevin O'Connor, Chief of FinCEN's Virtual Assets Section, about how the U.S. Financial Intelligence Unit regulates the crypto space. But first, inside the lab, where I share data-driven insights from our blockchain intelligence team. Earlier this year, TRM put out our illicit crypto economy report. Over the next few shows, I'm going to be going through in detail what the report says, and really more importantly, what it means. Why are these trends the way they are? Why are we seeing this activity in the crypto space? Here are the key trends that shaped the illicit crypto economy in 2023, according to TRM's blockchain intelligence team. First, total illicit volumes were down. Across the entire crypto ecosystem, illicit fund volumes dropped by about a third, from $49.6 billion in 2022 to $34.9 billion in 2023. The share of illicit funds as a proportion of all crypto value also fell to 0.63% in 2023 from 0.7% in 2022. Both figures, this is really important to point out, are higher than existing industry estimates, reflecting that TRM Labs captures more illicit volume, especially linked to sanctions, scams, and investment fraud, and captures illicit activity across a greater number of blockchains. Sanctions volumes also plummeted. The total value of funds subject to sanctions by the U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, fell to $16.1 billion in 2023 from $25.4 billion in 2022. Hack proceeds fell by over 50% to $1.8 billion from $3.7 billion in 2022. Scams and fraud volume also dropped to $12.5 billion from $14 billion in 2022. Sales of illicit drugs on darknet marketplaces grew to $1.6 billion from $1.3 billion recorded in 2022. 45% of all illicit volume occurred on the Tron blockchain in 2023. That's up from 41% in 2022. This was followed by Ethereum at 23% and Bitcoin with 18%. Tether, USDT, was the stablecoin with the largest amount of illicit volume over 2023 at $20.4 billion. And finally, Tether dominated terrorist financing. Hamas and other groups announced moratoriums on crypto donations over 2023, likely in response to greater international law enforcement scrutiny. This became particularly acute in the wake of Hamas's attack on Israel in October 2023, which spurred leading exchanges and cryptocurrency businesses to freeze assets linked to Hamas and its sympathizers. Yet among those terror financing campaigns that continued to accept cryptocurrency, the number of Tether addresses rose by 125%. So what does all this mean? Why are we seeing these trends? It's likely a number of factors, and we're going to go through all of those in the next few weeks. But those downward trends were accompanied by increased pressure from governments and law enforcement bodies. For example, we saw the US alone triple the number of crypto-related sanctions activity. We've seen tools and training implemented in law enforcement agencies all over the world. We've seen improved tracing capabilities from tools like TRM. There's so many other factors at play here, right? The price of cryptocurrencies that we've seen fluctuate over the last year. Over the next few weeks, we are going to dig into each of these trends and really understand the why in addition to the what when it comes to crypto crime. Now, I sit down with Kevin O'Connor. Kevin, thank you so much. This is honestly a long time coming. I've wanted to have you on TRM Talks for some time, so thank you so much for joining me.
Ari, I'm really excited to be here and get a chance to chat with you about this.
So before we dig into sort of FinCEN and FinCEN's role in the overall crypto ecosystem, we'd love to kind of hear about your journey a little bit. Crypto, compliance, regulation, enforcement. How did we end up here, these roles?
Yeah, sometimes I keep asking myself that same question. I've always been sort of driven in like a policy government focus. And one way or another, when I was younger, at first I was in local government and working in a lot of different capacities, legislative affairs and policy roles. And I really wanted to pivot into the government. And I think I used that opportunity to really try to look for the right place for me. And I sort of fell into FinCEN because of the type of work that was there. It wasn't initially what I was cued into. I didn't really know a lot about the BSA going in, but I was really fortunate to have a lot of mentoring relationships and partners that really helped me understand the role of the agency and the Bank Secrecy Act. And as a policy wonk and nerd, it was the Bank Secrecy Act was really appealing to me. Just the way it was constructed was so interesting. And it's really not that large of a set of laws and regulations compared to other things. So if you spend a lot of time with it, you really have the opportunity to catch on to it. And fast forward 15 years later this May, and I've really stuck with it. It's really something that's resonated with me. And I think my journey at the beginning of that started off working strictly compliance issues. I then did a detail with the Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. So that was right around the 2013, 2014 period, right when FinCEN's issuing that guidance, right? That really helped me understand both the technical elements of what's going on there, but also the policy elements. And that's really in compliance and enforcement where we saw that marriage. It's really understanding how the technology intersects with the policy.
That's awesome. If you're willing to dig into that like slightly, 2013, what are the conversations for folks who aren't tracking? And I get this. What's the deal at like, especially within this terrorism and financial? Wait, there's FinCEN and TFFC, which is a policy shop, and there's OFAC. All of these entities are essentially working together under Secretary of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence.
TFI really was birthed out of the 9/11 aftermath. It was really a need to make sure that we were coordinated and using all of the tools and authorities, including the new ones that were issued after the Patriot Act, in an appropriate and holistic way. And I think it's that sort of spirit that led us to sort of look at how we could do some of this initial work in the cryptocurrency space, sort of look at what tools are appropriate. Do we need to do anything to our existing rules to modify them to make sure we're covered here? How concerned should we be? What kind of resources should we devote at it? I think that is the kind of coordination that we sort of saw TFI wide.
So then going back to this kind of the initial point, like, right, so it is early. I mean, no one is really talking about this as an issue. And there are watersheds. I had Dante Disparte from Circle on a couple weeks ago. We talked about Libra and what happened when Libra launched. But 2013 is before all of that. What was it that caused TFI and FinCEN in particular to start thinking about crypto, which was honestly a pretty niche kind of area, certainly within a larger financial system, and definitely back then?
I think it's a combination of things. We're always trying to stay attuned to what people are talking about and how money is going to be moved. You start seeing more conversations online about things, whether it's about GOX or Silk Road, or a lot of different ways of having more electronic, all online means of moving money or value that substitutes for currency that you might not otherwise consider. And I think that's really what led to that 2013 guidance. I mean, the 2013 guidance, when we put it out, was really just an affirmation that, hey, we're an activity based regime, right? We're going to look at how something is being used. And if that qualifies you as a financial institution, that means that there are rules in place already that are going to cover you.
Talk a little bit about FinCEN generally, if you wouldn't mind. It's the financial intelligence unit within the United States government. Get beyond that. What does the day to day look like at an organization like FinCEN?
It's one of those situations where we wear a lot of hats, right? So we have this role where we're receiving all of this data and information from, different financial institutions based on their obligation. We also have, as a part of that, the obligation to interact with other FIUs around the world to sort of appropriately share information and sort of help calibrate, how that information is shared. Unlike a lot of other FIUs, we're a regulator. We have the obligation to make sure that financial institutions are complying with their obligations of the BSA. We also promulgate the rules that they're supposed to follow based on that information and, obviously have other tools like the ability to issue certain alerts when we identify typologies, issue other types of guidance when we think it's appropriate, or administrative rulings when we need interpretations. We are a network. And I think that's one of the really interesting things about FinCEN is we necessarily have to have these partnerships with the private sector. with law enforcement, with the Department of Justice, with our foreign counterparts. It's really a way of making sure that we have a more resilient financial system.
Talk a little bit about kind of the role that you see for FinCEN in the crypto space in particular.
We're really involved in the early efforts of the FATF to help build international guidelines through the Financial Action Task Force around there. The initial 2014 effort that they had, all the way through the more recent guidance that they put out there. We issued new guidance in 2019 that sort of consolidated some of our other efforts and reiterated the obligations that exist. And then, my shop is really focused, and we've taken 7 civil enforcement actions in 2015 that really sort of focus on not just what people are doing incorrectly and where there are violations, but also sort of driving compliance about what people can do better. That is what you want to see if you're a private sector person as well. You want experts in the space who understand the space, who know where the illicit finance risks are, so that you can tackle them appropriately.
So kind of digging into the more recent work, if you will, I think you kind of just laid out what I sort of think of as the playbook. You're providing as much guidance as you possibly can to industry, and at the same time, you're taking action against non-compliant entities in the space. Twofold, to punish, right? But really to send a message to the broader industry. React to that, and then maybe talk about a couple examples of how you guys are executing on that playbook at the moment.
I think it's a perfect example of how civil and criminal partner-like cases have a value when you're looking at the same thing. And most people are going to be familiar with the general scope of what happened in November when we made the announcement. I mean, the $3.4 billion civil money penalty is obviously what's going to capture a lot of people's attention, since it's the highest in Treasury history. I like to focus on some of the other elements of that, both what makes the case unique, but also like the compliance lessons. The first thing, I think, it's something that began in 2018 with just FinCEN and IRS CI having these like parallel investigations that sort of started up. But you'll note, like, when the final resolution came last November, it really became a whole of government effort to tackle a problem that sort of shows the size and scope of what was going on there. And I think what's unique about FinCEN's consent order compared to some of our other government partners, we've repeatedly, basically since the beginning, have stated that, look, you can't do business wholly or substantial part in the United States and expect to comply with our laws. And I think one of the real big takeaways is the ability that, that is not an acceptable position to take, and there are consequences. And I think secondarily, you can really look at products and services, I think, is something that's sort of not really appreciated as well. If you look at one of the elements in the finance case that FinCEN really highlights is being able to offer products and services and being able to appropriately mitigate risk around. I think TRM obviously has a unique perspective on this, doing blockchain investigation, but you can probably tell as much as anyone that blockchains are different, right? And there's different risks associated with different cryptocurrencies. And I think one of the things that Binance was cited for is offering, anonymity enhanced cryptocurrencies, or cryptocurrencies that aren't available through blockchain tracing tools. So the message there really being like, you can have a blockchain tracing tool, but if you're offering products and services that aren't on that blockchain tracing tool, you still have an obligation to understand how money is moving through accounts with that currency. And then, obviously, the big one from us in Binance, obviously, is the suspicious activity reporting. I mean, I think we identified, over 100,000 transactions that have potential SAR filing implication. These are really, really important elements to sort of correct past behavior.
Folks should understand, we talk all the time in the crypto space about not having legal clarity, or sort of, not having rules of the road. This is a pretty easy area, right? Like, there are certain DeFi and mixers and all kinds of other stuff we'll get into a bit later. But like, when it comes to VASPs, right? Crypto exchanges, custodians, brokers, ATMs, it's pretty clear. They have the same obligations under the Bank Secrecy Act as any financial institutions, as any money service business. Is that just anything I'm missing there?
No, look, and I think we've been very clear, and the drumbeat has been very steady. I think it would be very difficult for someone to make the argument that they're covered if that's their mode of business, particularly, for the 2019 guidance that showed even more specific examples of what took place there. But the fundamental idea being, again, we're an activity-based regime. It's not that FinCEN regulates Bitcoin. It's not that FinCEN regulates Ether or anything else. We regulate how it's being used. And so if you accept currency funds or value that substitute for currency and transmit currency funds or value that substitutes for currency to another person or location by any means, you're a money transmitter unless you meet one of the exemptions under the rule.
Any sort of key pieces, whether they're from Binance or honestly, I call them the bit cases, BitGo, BitPay, BitTrex, right across the board, that are really fundamental expectation from FinCEN when it comes to compliance?
I think there's a classic argument. It's really your compliance should be growing with your company. And I think a lot of these examples that you just read out, you really saw companies focusing on the commercial element and scaling really, really rapidly to be enormous, but not scaling compliance in a commensurate way. And I think that leads to very obvious flaws.
You mentioned SARS a couple times in the course of the conversation. Let's kind of dig in there a little bit. Obviously, a huge part of what FinCEN does is essentially receive SAR reporting, suspicious activity reports from financial institutions to include vast cryptocurrency businesses. Talk a little bit about sort of what you're seeing from crypto when it comes to SARS and why it's an important piece of the puzzle.
I think there's a tendency to not fully understand or appreciate what goes into SAR filings and how valuable they can be to law enforcement, to investigation. I think one of the things I'd like to step back and sort of talk about is instead of looking at SARs from like an individual perspective, I do think we need to start thinking about other ways that they add value. And I think one of those are like can be seen through like our financial trend analyses that have been coming out recently. So last week we put out one on elder financial
Yeah.
exploitation, right? So really digging into what financial institutions are filing and being able to build and tell a story about what illicit finance looks like that. That's not something that can be done with one institution's single SAR.
This is so interesting. This is not at all how I think about SAR reporting. I think of it, when I was a prosecutor, I was on a SAR task force and we were digging through mountains of SARs trying to find the needle in the haystack of like a good case. But this is different. And I think really potentially really powerful understanding trends and networks.
As a prosecutor and as a law enforcement agent, look, that's what you want to do. Look, this is my bad guy. I need the information on bad guy to finalize and finish my case. That's a completely logical thing. And that's like what intuitively we think. If we're a financial institution, I file on bad guy. I want it to trigger, law enforcement guy to take the thread and
Yeah.
follow it to the end. But I think what gets lost in that is look at it from a macro scale. And I think this is like part of the value that FinCEN brings to the data is one, looking at the financial trend analysis, you can say, okay, what should we be focused on? Maybe we need to be more focused on elder financial exploitation based on the reporting we're getting from financial institutions, right? We've done multiple ones on ransomware. There's a lot of trends in there that show some really interesting things that can help both financial institutions calibrate their compliance, but also may help law enforcement figure out that they need to be looking at particular things there as well. So one of the things I think is really fascinating in the ransomware financial trend analysis is we get financial institutions that give us Monero addresses in SAR files. And I think that's something that people don't necessarily appreciate. There may actually be some reporting that we're getting from certain private sector, actors on particular interests. Like there's a lot of macro that can be pulled from that. And I think there's a success story there to be told on compliance too, right? Because we've been so early in this space, we've seen a lot of SARs. I think we're over 500,000 crypto related SARs that FinCEN has seen in our database since I think 2012. And what's interesting about that is 95% of those are coming from the virtual asset service providers themselves. So like the majority of crypto SAR filings are coming from the crypto sector. That is a compliance success story. And I think there's a couple interesting things there. I think from 2022 to 2023, I think we saw basically a 70% increase in crypto related SARs in what we were getting. So it basically jumped from 300,000 crypto SARs in 2022 to 500,000 in 2023. And I think like that is a good sign for compliance about what we're seeing. And again, that's coming from VASPs themselves.
One thread that obviously I'm really interested in throughout the conversation is that relationship between FinCEN and law enforcement. I think, we've joked even today before jumping on that you guys don't lock anyone up, right? It's you're a regulator, very different. You're taking enforcement action, civil penalties, etc. But you work hand in hand with IRSCI, which you've mentioned, FBI, HSI, DEA, Secret Service, sort of down the line, and then globally.
We have a long history of that at FinCEN. I think, the Helix action against mixing, we obviously did in coordination with DOJ and IRSCI as appropriate. But I think one that was a big deal at the time that people tend to forget that sort of set the ground for this foreign located MSB was really the BTCE case in 2017. And I think that was a really good early example of how we could work with our partners in IRSCI, in the Department of Justice, and really target, which remember, people might forget now, but BTCE at its height was really the third largest fast operating. You know, Public reporting has said that up to 95% of ransomware was going through BTCE at the time of its takedown. That is an area where law enforcement has the tools to go extraterritorially and interdict and seize servers, make arrests, and make those coordinations. We have the ability to assess civil money penalties against the company, in this case, about 110 million, and the individual as well. The lessons from that were really, really important, saying that it was the first time we took an action against a foreign located MSB and really planted the seed for this concept that, hey, we are going to enforce our rules.
We've talked about the way that FinCEN has used its authorities effectively to go after non-compliant VASPs, the way that law enforcement is working to go after sort of bad actors in the space. Seems, I think, pretty clearly that mixers are a huge concern for the U.S. Treasury Department. And obviously, this is not just a FinCEN thing. This is very clearly across the department and really the government. We recently saw DOJ arrest the developers, co-founders of Samurai, which is a Bitcoin-based mixer. This all started when OFAC sanctioned decentralized mixer on Ethereum, Tornado Cash, a couple of years ago. Since then, we've seen Sinbad, Blender.io. And from FinCEN's perspective, we recently saw an NPRM on mixing activity, right? Should there be heightened due diligence reporting requirements for mixing transactions? Talk a little bit, if you can, maybe as high level or as into the weeds as you're willing to go, on sort of Treasury's view of mixers and why some of those concerns exist.
I think there's a couple parts to that too. And, again, we've been very clear about what our expectations are for mixing services. If a mixer is acting as a money transmitter, our expectation is that they're going to comply with the obligations of the Bank Secrecy Act. And, I would point to the 2020 Helix case as a great example of saying this is a US financial institution that's operating just like any other cryptocurrency service. We expect them to comply. In that case, they did not. So I think that sort of gave us a flavor of how we sort of view this. Look, anytime that there's a tool that can be used to make it easier for people to transact in a more opaque way that's exploited by illicit actors, that's going to be a concern for us. It's really the typology and understanding that there has to be some way for someone to operate in a legitimate manner to sort of unwind that transaction when it's right.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, TRM responded to the NPRM. My/our view was, hey, this is complicated. It is what regulators need to do is thread a needle between allowing lawful users a degree of privacy in a more open financial system and at the same time stop North Korea from laundering $1 billion through a decentralized mixer. And that's a challenge. And I'm really hopeful that, really smart people, work to figure this out. Staying on the tracing piece, I guess, a little bit, obviously blockchain intelligence like TRM is a huge part of what you do, which actually is kind of unique for a regulator. We see obviously law enforcement use this tool, all day long to trace and track the flow of funds to build investigations, but there are really only a handful of regulators using it to really kind of understand, what are the risks within their regulated ecosystem. Can you talk a little bit about that use case and maybe how you use blockchain intelligence tools?
Yeah. And I think we obviously use it in a few different ways. It does help us sort of look at, illicit finance more holistically and identify potential leads for investigation. Obviously, if there are entities that are receiving a lot of illicit funds that might not be registered, but seem to have US touch points, I mean, those are obviously concerns for us. When there's more transparency into illicit activity, we have this ability to see what financial institutions have potential exposure there. And that sort of helps us determine if there might be anti-money laundering gaps at particular financial institutions. Also, we're very big proponents of the fact that looking at transaction monitoring as a tool for compliance is very important. We've highlighted that you need to have a calibrated risk-based anti-money laundering program that considers how you're looking at transactions, how you're meeting record-keeping reporting obligations. And I think that, blockchain intelligence is going to be an important part of that when you're a virtual asset service provider. Or if you're a more traditional financial institution and you have customers or exposure that are sort of associated with that. We definitely look at it very holistically. Financial institutions are going to be reporting transactions to us. They give us wallet IDs, they give us transaction hashes. We need to be able to dive deeper and build our own heuristics to sort of look at those more and determine if there are trends there, following bad money and tipping off law enforcement. All really important. I think from a regulator's perspective where I sit, we don't always follow the money in the traditional sense law enforcement does, where it's like one bad guy through to the other. We're looking at, is there an intermediary that is common to those people that might say, why is everyone cashing out this particular entity? Are we seeing corresponding SAR filings that match that activity on chain? Is that a problem? Why are we not seeing that?
Building on this sort of technology piece, what are you thinking? What is next here when it comes to thinking through sort of thoughtful regulation for this ecosystem as it grows, as it develops, maybe as it becomes more private, maybe less private, we'll see.
We're trying to look as holistically as possible there. And I think one of the key features of the AMLA, the Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2020, is feedback loops, right? There's like a lot of built-in feedback loops for us to engage with our government partners and law enforcement and justice and other regulatory agencies, but also the private sector. We're not trying to build something, in a vacuum where we're just thinking about it by ourselves. I think we're legitimately interested in building the best system that provides the most security.
So what do you do when you're not doing crypto enforcement cases? What
Oh
does
man, I don't know when I'm not doing crypto
yeah.
enforcement cases, but I love my place in DC. Aside from spending time with my family, I'm a cook. I like food. My closet hobby is I'm a birder. And my disclosure to you, Ari, is I also like to run.
We have got to get you out there for TRM Running Club, but let's go into the birding a little bit. Where does one go birding in the sort of DC area? And then what are the coolest things that you've seen?
I have a lot of hot spots that I like, but I'm a big fan of both Teddy Roosevelt Island
Yeah.
and Kingman Island on the Anacostia River. But I think my favorite is definitely Kenilworth Aquatic Gardens. I feel like is a real solid birding spot.
Amazing. I feel like the qualities that a regulator has, patience, focus, right? I feel like there's a lot of qualities that may be useful for birding as well, or vice versa.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for this. I think that is something I didn't know about you. So thank you for joining TRM Talks.
Thank you, Ari. Really appreciate the time today and really appreciate your work in the space.
I've wanted Kevin on the show for a really long time, and we've known each other for a while when we were both working at Treasury together. He has been the foremost expert on the Bank Secrecy Act and really how it applies to cryptocurrency in the world. And I think that was very evident in our conversation today. I remember I was hosting a very early TRM Talks on AML, and I used the term unregulated VASP, virtual asset service provider. And Kevin texted me and he said, never, ever use that term. Every VASP is regulated. So now, if you notice over the years, I never have said unregulated VASP. I use the term non-compliant VASP, right? Because it's regulated, but it might be non-compliant. But that's kind of what I mean, that really, really, truly understanding the nuance of the Bank Secrecy Act and how it applies to crypto. And I think it was just evident there. It's also really extraordinary to just look back at FinCEN's history in this space, right? We're talking really, really early guidance that was either right before or right around the same time that the Financial Action Task Force started putting out guidance in the crypto space. So not only is Kevin the foremost expert on this stuff, but he's been doing it for so long that he really he's either been a part of writing or a part of really understanding and interpreting every important crypto anti-money laundering guidance that's been put out by the United States. And that was evident in the conversation today. Next on TRM Talks, I sit down with CoinDesk reporter Nick Day. If you love the show, leave a review wherever you're listening to it. Follow us on LinkedIn to subscribe to our newsletter, The Weekly Roundup, to get the latest news on crypto regulation, compliance, and investigations.
TRM Talks is brought to you by TRM Labs, the leading provider of blockchain intelligence and anti-money laundering software. This episode was produced in partnership with Voltage Productions. The music for this show was provided by Ecolix.
Now, let's get back to building.